In case you missed it, last week it was announced that E3 is coming back as a physical event, and this time it's gonna be different. Well, at least according to the ESA and their new partners over there at ReedPop. If you are unfamiliar, the ESA is the organization in charge of running E3, and ReedPop is the company that produces PAX in all of its iterations, as well as other major events like New York Comic Con, Emerald City Comic Con, the Star Wars Celebration, and the Minecraft Festival. They do some others as well, but those are the big ones. So as I mentioned at the top, the ESA is partnering with ReedPop in hopes of bringing E3 back to life. Kyle Marsden-Kish, Global VP of Gaming at ReedPop, said in a statement that E3 2023 will be recognizably epic, a return to form that honors what's always worked while reshaping what didn't. The organizers also said E3 2023 will welcome publishers, developers, media, and buyers to the show, and will present digital showcases and, quote, in-person consumer components, unquote. That sounds to me like some kind of a merch store. You know, you could probably imagine other ways you might be able to spend money at a big event like a PAX or something like that, but now they're gonna kind of bring that mentality environment to E3 is what it sounds like. They also added there will be Titanic AAA reveals, earth-shaking world premieres, and exclusive access to the future of video games. Now, I think I've said this on this channel before, but I think E3 as a brand is kind of too big to die. I mean, think about all of the games writers and a lot of people who are still using E3 to describe those 2 weeks in June where all those game announcements happened, even though E3 as an event, as the official event, was completely canceled, nowhere to be seen, right? But people still using that term. So it certainly has staying power, and obviously, you know, it really has staying power that the ESA has teamed up with ReedPop to kind of reinvent the event, as it were. Also, take into account that video game publishers rely on the ESA to help them collectively lobby the United States government, so they will always be obligated to support the ESA in some form. So basically, yeah, if you didn't know, the ESA is kind of like a bridge between the video game industry in general and lawmakers across the United States. And that is a real double-edged sword depending on the issue. For example, the ESA helps defend video games as a form of protected speech, therefore maintaining the medium's full First Amendment rights. Even just last year, a proposed amendment came up in Illinois that sought to ban the sale of all violent video games, and they kind of were looking to redefine what violent video games, the term violent video games means. So using the resources from members of the ESA, or rather kind of all these different publishers and video game developers, pretty much every one of the major ones you can think of, the organization can basically step in and represent the video game industry's creative and financial interests. In this case, that would mean continuing to disprove a direct correlation between playing violent video games and people who enact real-world violence. The ESA also funds research, collects data, provides legal and policy analysis as new video game-related issues come up, and raises general awareness about potential issues in the future. When all of the abuse allegations started coming out against Activision Blizzard, the ESA said it would convene its members to create a dialogue and shape actions to help future allegations be acknowledged, thoroughly investigated, and addressed with meaningful consequences. Whether or not that was just flowery language, it's pretty hard to say, because as I mentioned, the ESA is kind of like a double-edged sword, because at the end of the day, they do also represent the video game industry's business interests. For example, in 2018, the ESA tried to defend loot boxes, arguing they're not a form of gambling. Luckily, they made a terrible argument that failed horribly, but it's still a real bad look for the games industry overall. For one, the organization blanketly supporting a mechanic that's clearly problematic and really does need a firmer hand when it comes to self-regulation. Cough, cough, you know, years later now we have Diablo Immortal. And secondly, making such a poor argument in support of loot boxes, I think that it could certainly make the members question the ESA's effectiveness at actually protecting the game industry's interests, right? If they, you know, went to bat for this thing and just kind of failed miserably, how are they going to do when the stakes are really high or when they really matter? Especially when it comes to the larger goal, I think, for the game industry, which is avoiding government regulation. Outside of that, the public perception of the ESA over the last few years has basically just been the role of driving E3 right into the ground. Even before COVID, there was a pretty open discourse that the event was waning in relevance, with less publisher and vendors turning up year over year. In 2016, Wargaming, Disney Interactive, Activision, and EA all dropped out of the annual convention. Of course, Sony would follow suit in 2019, coming to the same conclusion that the previous publishers had, that it's much cheaper and potentially more effective to run their own digital showcases with new game announcements outside of or around E3 instead of trying to compete for attention during the show. In response to the fallout in 2016 and in an effort to bolster relevancy, the ESA opened up E3 to the general public in 2017, with tickets costing between $150 and $250, depending on when you got them. Now, outside of being part of a historic industry event and having the potential to buy some fun, meme-worthy merch, I think that's a pretty hefty price to pay to stand in line for 3 hours at a time to play the demo for an unfinished game. But, for what it's worth versus a PAX or a Gamescom, there just isn't much to do at E3 compared to these other successful events. Despite that, tickets would still sell out repeatedly, meaning as there were less and less vendors and exhibitors left at the show, attendance numbers were still rising. It's a really weird kind of situation, which I'm not sure if it completely offset the price because booth space for vendors and exhibitors is really expensive. I'm not sure if they completely offset the cost of that with, public attendance. But traditionally, in the past, E3 has been an industry exclusive event where only retailers, exhibitors, and game press were allowed to attend. So the booths and the floor demos aren't really set up for moving large amounts of people through. Even after a couple of years of allowing general admission, it seemed like the ESA still had a really tough time finding the right balance between building an event for industry insiders as well as the general public. As you probably know, E3 was canceled due to COVID in 2020. It had a pretty rough go at a digital event in 2021, and then it was canceled again this year, all along the way, with every chip or loose block, people shouting, or at the very least, joking that E3 is dead or dying. Now, next year's revival of E3 puts Jeff Keighley's 2023 Summer Game Fest on a collision course with an even more crowded month of video game news and announcements. If you remember, Keighley used to work alongside E3, kind of hosting this thing called the Coliseum or E3 Coliseum, where they would bring in all the big developers and all the big industry luminaries to do interviews with Keighley, and they kind of put on a show there. And then they'd also do gameplay walkthroughs and demos, and sometimes even show trailers there. So it was a big part of E3, but he decided to split ways, I believe in 2020, and start his own thing with Summer Game Fest, which is supposed to be kind of an alternate event or digital event at first. He had his own big announcements. I think one year they did the reveal for Tony Hawk 1 and 2, the remakes, and then this year it was Callisto Protocol. He got the reveal for that and the first kind of gameplay demo, I believe. So can kind of pull in these big announcements, but this year's Summer Game Fest certainly suffered from being between a big PlayStation State of Play and an Xbox event, which were both unsurprisingly able to secure larger, more exciting announcements for themselves. And now that problem is going to be even worse next year for Keighley, depending on which developers and publishers sign up for E3. To further complicate things, Summer Game Fest will also have a physical presence next year. The official dates haven't been revealed yet for either event, but you can imagine a slew of logistical issues popping up for both publishers and attendees, depending on where each event lands on the calendar. To wrap things up, I'll just add that the ESA has certainly had issues with partners in the past. However, you would think if there is a company capable of revitalizing E3 and bringing it back to some form of glory, it's probably a company like ReedPop, who has a lot of experience producing these high volume kind of fan experiences or events like PAX, like New York Comic Con, and that sort of thing. So, there's hope, I guess. All right, that's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think. Is E3 back for reals, or is it just destined for the grave at this point? Thank you so much again for watching, and for more video game news and updates, be sure to stay tuned right here to Inside Gaming.